Good evening, everybody. It's really lovely to be with you. Am I right in saying that there's a bit of tension in the room? And that actually you just want me to get on with it, right? Am I reading you correctly? No chance. I flew all the way here. I'm going to make sure that I talk to you for a very long time. No, I'm kidding. So, Kunjani, Dumelang, Heita, how's it? That's 2 of our official languages and 2 of our unofficial ones. Thank you very much for having me here, Peter, and to Bernard. I'm really appreciative. I've heard only wonderful things about ACME, and being there today, I can understand why. So good evening, dignitaries and finalists as well. So I know from my work as a judge of the CNN Multi-Choice African Journalist of the Year Awards that Uganda has a fine journalism community. And I know it's getting stronger and stronger. Now, I don't just say this because when I went to Tanzania last year, they kept tweeting me and asking me, so why do we never win? How come we never win? And I didn't know what to say. I hid away for a lot of the time. I'm very happy here to know that I've seen many of your names come up again and again and again as finalists or as winners. In fact, many winners. I was looking again at all the Ugandan people who have been commended, finalists, and who have won from 2008 onwards. So when my colleagues said to me, you're going to Uganda, just behave, don't say anything about gay rights and don't talk about any of your usual radical stuff, because Ugandans are a very proper people and you mustn't go and mess things up and misrepresent South Africa. So I said, okay, and I prepared a speech in that vein. That is until I read your newspapers this morning. And in one of them I see that it says Ugandans don't love helmets and neither do they love condoms. I thought that cannot be. And in another paper I read this from a pastor of yours who explained our world thus. The married women now waste their time on painting their fingers, plaiting their hair, visiting boutiques, attending wedding functions, and their husbands are left in the house with housemaids. So that was a very interesting explanation. I will immediately get this nail polish off my fingers. I think your media community is getting very exciting, more and more exciting. But I wondered for a moment if we could just stand in remembrance of young, aspirational, beautiful people like yourselves who died so tragically in Garissa, but also if we could stand to honor the journalists who are turning #147, not just a name, into a most amazing anti-terror campaign. So if I could ask you to join me for 1 minute as we remember our colleagues. Thank you very much. May they rest in peace. And also for me to acknowledge the death of Joan Kagezi. I've been reading with some horror about how that's gripping our headlines. So I was telling my mom about the awards that I was coming here when Al Jazeera flashed a warning. It said, Uganda on terror alert. And being 84, she said to me, I'm sure you can postpone it. I said, absolutely no ways, Ma. Back in my rainbow nation, Ugandans, people from the DRC, Pakistanis, Somalians and Zimbabweans are holed up in places of refuge in the city called Durban. It follows a very harsh year in South Africa, where Pakistanis, Bangladeshis and mostly Somalians have been hounded out of the shops they've started across South African townships. South Africa is engaged in a massive process of othering people who have come to live here. I find this deeply sad because as a country which opened its borders in '94 in recognition of what countries like yours did for ours, after 20 years it feels to me like those links of solidarity and of Pan-Africanism are withering on the vine. So in Garissa, the Al-Shabaab militants separated Christian from Muslim. They slayed one and they saved the other. You'll notice the other. I think our continent's harsh identity politics of making others of people who should be our brothers and sisters now threatens a very nascent renaissance when we were finally taking our place at the big table. So in an era of new Pan-Africanism and of borders opening and have been forced open more rapidly than ever, Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram are forces like ISIS that want to regress our progress. How do we cover them as journalists? I think about this so hard, I had no idea how to get a journalist into Garissa. How do we cover them when the old rules of journalism are thrown out of the door? I'm talking about the conventions which meant that before we were regarded pretty much as doctors or as ambulance workers. We were safe from the fire of both sides. But those conventions and rules are gone now. I'm thinking about the lives, how we saw James Foley, Stephen Sotloff, my colleague Anton Hummel from South Africa, killed mercilessly, where journalists become targets for assassination. They're fair games, they're the tools of ransom, the tools of propaganda. It's extraordinarily dangerous to be a journalist today. The battlefields of Iraq, of Syria, of the DRC, of Garissa, of Nairobi, of Maiduguri show us how very dangerous our craft is. And so what do we as African journalists do? How do we cover these properly? How do we cover them when we're not operating in hard currency and when we're unable to purchase the security that CNN, Al Jazeera and others do for their journalists? To kit a journalist out with an intelligence operative, with security and with the correct safety equipment, as many of you know, can cost thousands of dollars for a single assignment. I don't know about you, but we're simply unable to do that task. I think the instinct in such times is to become one with the security complex, to tell the stories of the armies and of intelligence. And I find it deeply worrying. I was wondering if we could talk about some of that tonight. But so just because you may be wondering, so why did they get her here? I think Peter briefed me. I usually correct people who call me Asian and tell them that in fact I'm African. When I've traveled to India, I may look and sound a little bit like the people there, but I feel alien. And when I fly home into OR Tambo Airport, our lovely airport in Johannesburg, I feel like I can finally breathe. It smells, it feels, it navigates like home. So I draw on these identities I grew up with. Growing up for me was a pretty hard time. It was in apartheid South Africa. The Group Areas Act blew apart the places of no races where my family grew up. The law to keep different racial groups apart, they classified us as black, white, colored, Indian, began to bite, and we were forced out of the city center to live on its outskirts. Because I was of mixed racial heritage, we ended up in a place called Bosmont, not very far from Johannesburg. Until I learned to question, I didn't know that it was odd to grow up with people who looked like me, who sounded like me, although my country is one of such incredible diversity. Only when I was about 8 years old did I realize that this was in fact a form of social engineering. And until conscientized at a good school about this odd set of affairs, I didn't realize it. So Bosmont was a fairly desolate place. And my parents would take us to the Zoo Lake. Any of you ever been to the Zoo Lake in Johannesburg? I invite you there since you haven't been. Where we could walk on green grass and look at the water. To get there and to get back was like tripping across different worlds. So the Zoo Lake is situated in the prettiest parts of Johannesburg. The homes are large. In those days I'd stare at them and look over the walls into the people having parties and splashing in pools. And they were all white people. I thought to myself, wow, they've got to be very talented people. Only once I began to learn about apartheid did it all begin to fit into place. And I understood that this was the grand design of making a racial market economy. People of my shade were trained largely to be clerical workers at banks or to staff the buoyant clothing industry. What a design and how well it worked. It felt impermeable for the longest time, and I felt almost imprisoned there, which is where journalism came in, or where writing came in. It was on my school newspaper that I first realized the power of the word. Because I think what it gives you, first and foremost, if you come from a history like mine, is a voice. From there, I began to understand the power of what we do, which is to communicate, to advocate, and at its very best, journalism can change the world. And that's all I really believe in. I don't believe in journalism as marketing or journalism as commerce. I only believe in its ability to shape, reshape, and to change our world. And for me, it's always been about that. I don't consider it a career, but a method of social change. So brave journalists chronicled the horrors of apartheid and took the struggle of the youth of 1976 to the world's headlines. Sanctions and boycotts followed, and we know firmly that it was Ugandan solidarity with the ANC was a huge factor in the growing internationalization of the struggle against apartheid. And at its center again was the word. Journalism won over a generation of people to end a scourge of institutionalized racism. From that struggle, my life is a lifetime away from what it once was. Things began to change quickly in the media industry once Nelson Mandela was president. He pushed quite hard for the image of the editor to change. Most of the editors at the time were white male largely. And so we quickly began to appoint people like Boxing Williams, Jovial Rantau, Matata Tsedu, Mondli Makanya, Justice Malala. Some of them may be household names to you. But for a woman to be editor was pretty unheard of. I'm glad you have a few of them here. There were two women editors, Paula Frey Lakela Kaunda, who's now the Chief of Staff of President Jacob Zuma. So editors can go on to great things. So when the role was offered to me, I nearly fell off my chair after Trevor Nobe sounded me out. I believe he's come to speak to you before. He's the owner of a range of Zimbabwean newspapers and also of the Mail and Guardian. What? Me? It took me so much convincing to accept that job. And I think I was challenged into doing it when 3 white colleagues went to the board and basically told them that they didn't think I had the balls to do so. I hope that's not a rude word to use, but that's what they said. That was true, but I began to think that maybe balls weren't literal things, but symbol instead for courage and the negotiation skills it takes to be an editor of an investigative title. A supportive context made my country welcome me as editor, and I'm happy to report that since then, women hold most of the major media jobs in South Africa. There's Karima Brown in charge of all the independent titles, Felicia Oppel to edit the Sunday Times, the SABC and the biggest free-to-air broadcasters are all run by women. So people said it was a trailblazing position, and I was very, very proud to have it, although I'll admit to you that at first I just wanted to hide under my computer and stay there for a while. So if overcoming the gender barrier is the biggest issue is one of the biggest issues for our times, then so is this. So if I can ask you to share with me, and I can see that it's true, who here is on Twitter? I just want to get a little sampling. Who's on Twitter? Not now, I mean generally in life. Most. And Facebook? I think most of us are. WhatsApp? I got lots of messages from WhatsApp. Instagram? And then who's got a tablet? Everybody. Yeah, and a smartphone. So here's the bad news for us. Social media has made everybody a journalist. It has made, I would argue, our democracy safer in that very little can be hidden and information can flow freely. I think we are well out of the time when things can be kept from us, and we can name everything from Cape to Cairo to show that pattern. I would argue that the mobile phone and its attendant apps have altered Kenya's path and played a yet-to-be-chronicled role in the Nigerian election last week. I believe that they're starting to do the same here. On Friday, as we tallied the horrifying numbers out of Garissa, I really only looked at Twitter to get my information. My journalism consciousness is being built by the hashtag 147 more than a number. I think you see the best kind of journalism happening on Twitter almost as we speak. It's It's a shame to say, but I have more Twitter followers than City Press has got buyers. That's terrible. Please don't tell my bosses that. I'll be in all sorts of trouble. I think they know. I just think it's a symbol of the era that we live in. So digital life has reshaped and is reshaping journalism every day. How? And what does it mean for us? What do we do when everybody's a journalist? What does that make of our role? Changing the commercial underpinning of media completely. In South Africa, Woolworths and the banks are almost not advertising any longer. And if you go into any Woolies store, you'll see they have a daily paper called the Daily Difference at each entrance. I was trying to see if there was one at the Woolies here. But everyone's making their own media. I think the era has completely altered the meaning of the Fourth Estate. Are we really the bulwark of freedom and democracy any longer? And if we are going to be, how should we change our journalism? I think that the era throws up very complex challenges for us as journalists. News is really what happened yesterday. I think your newspapers are fresh and alive, but honestly, sometimes when I go through my 9 South African papers a day, I honestly feel like I'd read all of that previously. I think we live in a very different era. Narrative and storytelling become more important than they ever have been. Depth and significance, the so what factor that I believe ACME teaches, is really going to be the thing that sets us apart and gives us longevity. Traveling, going the extra mile, getting out of the urban centers into the rural hearts, that's going to be key for us. I'm not sure if any of you have looked at Snowfall and Invisible Child. They're both New York Times multi-platform narrative journalism experiences. I would go look if you have a chance. For me, they really are the next frontier of where we're going to go, because those stories are told in text, in video, in podcast, and in images. I think that is really going to be what our future is. At City Press, one of our best recent examples was when 34 miners and 10 security guards were killed at Marikana, a platinum mine near to Johannesburg in Rustenburg. We went out, it took us about 3 weeks of hard work to go and find each of the stories of each of the miners who died. And we told that story digitally as well as in print and in photographic exhibitions, and finally a book. It's my only experience recently of doing the kinds of storytelling the 21st century demands of us. And a big question I ask myself all the time, I see William Pike said that newspapers still set the agenda. I'm not sure that the mainstream media, be it radio, television or print, any longer sets the agenda. And that certainly poses huge challenges for us. I don't know how things are in your newsrooms, I'd love to hear, but ours are getting smaller and smaller, more freelancers. Just as we need to report more deeply, resources are stretched to make our work less so. I do think the future of good public journalism is going to be philanthropic. It's going to be supported with people with deep pockets and big hearts to do the kind of journalism that makes us worthy of being a Fourth Estate. There simply is no commercial model any longer, although the market is still growing where we are in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's a good thing. But undoubtedly the wave of disruption, we can see it coming, and we can see it coming just by how our own reading patterns are changing almost every day. People get their news for free. In this context, the business model is the tough one. The only 2 places making good money of digital, as far as I know, and maybe there's a few other examples, is the FT. And the luck it is to be Al Jazeera, where the Emir just gives you a pot of money to do wonderful journalism, and you don't have to worry too much about the bottom line. I think that's going to possibly be the future. I find that in such an atmosphere, we settle around the easy-to-reach topics. Showbiz, corruption or anti-corruption, politics or party politics. Africa Rising in this context is such an easy narrative. You only have to travel to most every African capital to see that it is a great story. Infrastructure, banking, mobile phones everywhere. Lots of Chinese people everywhere. Symbol of the continent's new major investor. A middle class like you, aspiring, interesting, questioning, bursting with potential. It is a story of Africa rising. But I would argue that it's not a singular narrative that we can sometimes treat it as. Without shared growth, or what we used to call development in the 90s, it'll be a mirage or create a version of a massive underclass and a slightly larger elite. I think that journalism needs to be more vigilant now than it ever has been, and not less vigilant, even as our continent becomes the talk of the global economy. And really, there's this thing that people also said to me, just don't talk about it, but I will. Our owners need to issue the time of the brown envelope. Agreed? No? Whenever I suggest this is a corruption similar to those forms of corruption we investigate, people jump on me. When I was in Uganda a few years ago, journalists came to me and said, no, but it's impossible. Our salaries are so low. We're freelance. They don't influence us. I would argue that brown envelopes fundamentally influence us. They skew who we cover and what we cover. And what I've known from the very many journalists I've spoken to is that they often have no choice but to take those things. And that for me, the issue of brown envelopes, it's an owner's issue. And I think our owners need to acknowledge the impact of this trend on our abilities to be good journalists. I think a lot about what the next set of Millennium Development Goals should be, because the first lot have expired. And I learned about these from your Richard Kavuma. Remember that he was CNN's African Journalist of the Year some years ago? And his award-winning sets of stories on the MDGs really taught me how to cover development. I think he set up a model that all of us can follow as we track the new goals currently being established by the UN. But in the era of Facebook and Twitter and celebrity, I think it's very tough work because attention spans are short. We live in a time where people are often looking at their phones, almost dying to look at their phones, wanting to check the latest news stream. We're doing many, many things at once. In that context, I don't know if the kinds of essays Richard did at the time would have the same kind of audience and following now. I think we've got to tell those stories in different ways, even than he brilliantly did at the time. Our work has to be as compelling as that makes us go to our phones. And what is that? We love sharing, so our work has to be able to be easily shared. I think images are more important than ever before. And mostly I think we need to be funny and interesting. That's been what makes BuzzFeed and Huffington Post so very, very successful. And also now I think that we compete not only locally with our colleagues and our peers in our countries, but increasingly I think your competitors would be the Free BBC, the Guardian, the Huffington Post, and also the New York Times. So all in all, it's a very tough time to be a journalist, but it couldn't be more exciting or more challenging or sadly more dangerous. Congratulations for what you do every day, and congratulations for getting here. I look very, very forward to see who those winners are going to be, but I think all the finalists are just wonderful for being here. Thank you very much.